And then he's holding the sword and he looks at me and he goes, "Hey, Bo, so for what federal agency are you buying all these guns?"
That question comes 2 years into the deepest undercover infiltration ATF has ever run against the American outlaw motorcycle gang. How an ex-petroleum geologist ended up holding an empty Tommy gun in front of a national president with a loaded .357 in the room starts with a gas station robbery in Oklahoma City.
Let me just start off. Blake Boteler, a long friend of mine, his motorcycle and story that we're about to tell are featured in the National Law Enforcement Museum. Blake was our July 2002 Officer of the Month at the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund. So I'm very familiar with his story, but there's so much about undercover law enforcement work that intrigues me, and I think our audience, most of them probably feel the same way. First off, okay, so you go deep undercover with a motorcycle gang. They're called the Outlaw motorcycle gang, one of the most dangerous in our nation at the time. And I'm just curious, for starters, Blake, I have no idea how an undercover operation really works in terms of, is this a 9 to 5 part of your life, a job like the rest of us have, and then you go home at the end of the day and everything's back to normal? You're living Blake Boteler's life, not this fake life that you're pretending to be a motorcycle gang member. Help us understand that for starters.
Wow, Craig, when you put it that way, it sounds like it could be fun, but no, there's a stark difference in the reality of it all. And you hit on it very well. I mean, if you're going to do a deep undercover operation, you have to, we call them infiltration operations, you have to become a part of that group. And the only way you can do that is by spending time with someone. You got to get to know them, and they want to get to know you. Many of our quick hit undercover operations, like if I'm going to go out and buy a bomb or a machine gun from someone, it would be a quick introduction by an informant. He might ask a question about my life, and I'd say, "Hey, listen, buddy, we're here for business. We're not getting into each other's lives. Let's just make money." And I would buy the machine gun from him, and we would part ways. There wouldn't be any interaction. But in a long-term infiltration like this, the whole goal was to spend hours and hours with all these individuals, these outlaw motorcycle gang members. In this case, it was the Sons of Silence. They were what known as one of the Big Five back in the day in the Midwest. So that was in Colorado. That's where their mother chapter was. So their national president and several of their national vice presidents. So we didn't have any informants to introduce us. So I had to do what we call a cold call and just slowly go into the bars and being seen and slowly getting to know them, shooting pool, every once in a while having an interaction, but not being too pushy. It took months and months just to begin to speak with several members before you could even start considering or thinking about plans on illegal gun sales or narcotic sales that they were involved in. So if you just walked into them and said, "Hello, who's got a machine gun for sale, or who's got some meth for sale?" They'd smell a cop a mile away.
So do they approach you eventually after you become kind of this person they see at the bar all the time? You're shooting pool with them, you're having some good talks and drinking together. Do they eventually bring you into the gang, or do you somehow initiate that idea with them?
Well, they actually, in this case, they had an associate of theirs, and he sent a girl over to me while I was shooting pool. And I'd ridden a motorcycle up to a bar and things. Now, this is Colorado, so this is October, September. It gets cool at night. So she comes up to me at the table, and I'd seen her talking to the Sons of Silence over there earlier. And she says, "Hey, why don't we get out of here? Why don't we go to your house?" And I knew that she was trying to see if I actually had a house. Was I a real person? So we had established an undercover house. that when you walk into it and flip on the switch, the cameras start rolling. So sure enough, I put her on the back of that 1963 Harley Davidson that's in the museum, and we rode about 2 miles to where the undercover house is located. I walked in, I flipped on the switch and started talking to her. I said, "Hey, can I get you a beer?" And she goes, "Well, where's your bathroom?" And I said, "Well, it's down the hall." She went down the hall. She came back out and she said, "I think we better get back up to the bar." And I said, "Okay, you don't want a beer or anything, huh?" She goes, No, I need to get back to the bar." I said, "Okay." So we got back on the motorcycle and we went back to the bar. She immediately went over to that associate of the club and was talking to him. So that exchange right there was just a test. And that.
So I have to interrupt though, Blake, because this is the question that one cop to another would ask.
Okay.
And everybody else is probably thinking, what if she said she wanted to bang you?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I've never encountered that in my whole life, whether in law enforcement or in my personal life.
She's asking you to take her back to your house. So
Exactly.
Maybe Billy knows all about that. I guess he asked that question because he's the expert.
Yeah, maybe I'd like to hear some of Billy's stories offline here. Maybe they're a lot better than some of mine. It's the accumulation of information that you're receiving. I see this girl, she has no interaction with me at all, but I see her talking to this associate at the club, and she keeps looking back over at me. He would talk to her, and she would look back over at me. So I could see this, okay, something's going on there. She's going to be coming up soon. And sure enough, here she comes. I just knew deep in my heart it was all a fake. Now, again, my only cover I had at the time was as soon as I go into that house and turn on the light switch, the cameras roll. So I have a camera rolling. So whatever story later on she might try to tell, that's going to be my backup. I knew deep in my heart that we're going to be leaving quick. Fortunately, she was the one that said it, because if she would have come out and said, "Hey, yeah, let's drink beer and hang out, and I brought some meth, let's snort it," I'd be going, "Hey, look."
Or maybe the beginning of your porn career.
Well, that would
Billy's trying to take this in one direction here.
I have a question related to all this. And that is, where do you draw the line when you go undercover, right? I mean, we've seen the TV version, but this is real life stuff. They do drugs. They hurt people. Sometimes they kill people. Where do you draw the line as an undercover agent? You're trying not to blow your cover, and they're probably trying to test you. How far are you willing to go to break the law in order to be part of the gang to make sure you're not an undercover cop? So what are you allowed to do that's maybe not good, and what can't you do?
And you know what? That is the dilemma. When you get into these long-term investigations, that is your dilemma every day. Now, for me, and you hit on them, obviously there's the girl factor. There's the drugs factor. There's the violence factor. Well, as an ATF agent, and just with my faith in my family, the way I look at the world, I can't allow people to get hurt in front of me. So early on in the investigation, even before I was a patch wearer, before I got into the club, there would be a fight would start in a bar between the Sons of Silence and someone else, and I would run across the bar and tackle the guy that they were trying to fight. And J.R. Reed, the national president, would see me do that over and over. And he said, "You know what?" Later on, he goes, you never start any fights, but you're always the first one to jump into it. Well, little did he know, it was because I knew if they hurt somebody seriously, then that would end this investigation. We can't stand by idly, any of us in law enforcement. We're there to serve and protect. We're not there to watch people get boot stomped. So, no, that one was a line. For the drug line, obviously, most of the Sons of Silence and most everybody they hang out with is snorting meth. That was the number one drug of choice in the outlaw biker world. Well, for me, I have a tattoo on my left arm, and it says, "Never forget." And it's 2 strands of barbed wire. Well, that came after the gunfight in Waco, that particular tattoo I got. And it's to never forget the sacrifice of those agents that day. But when they would see it, I told the national president, J.R. Reed, I said, that's never forget the promise I made my dying mother. The last thing I told her was I was going to quit meth and never do it again. I never talked to her again. And so J.R. Reed, even when I was as a prospect, would tell guys, don't be offering Bo any meth. He made a promise. So,
wow, that's very clever. Very
well. Again, those are the challenges. The female side of it. Early on, I didn't have a female undercover agent with me, but the president of the Colorado Springs chapter, he said, "Hey, is Bo gay? Because I never see him with any girls."
Wow.
Well, you're not going to make it very far in an outlaw motorcycle world if you are gay. So I immediately had to get a girl. So I called several female agents that I knew. And then as soon as I told them what it would entail, they would hang up on me. So finally, I talked to one in Denver, and Carrie, and she was great. She said, "Yeah, I'll come down." We had an elaborate introduction where I didn't introduce her. She actually made friends with a member of the club who introduced her to me. And then we became boyfriend, girlfriend. So if she took a burn and they found out she was ATF, I could say, "Hey, Bobby introduced her to me. I didn't know her."
You had some,
Yeah. So it's all about insulating yourself. Right. So that covered those three. I always had a female undercover agent that was my girlfriend that would come in just periodically. So I could always tell these other girls that would come at me, I'd say, I got an old lady. Right. And so, but, look, I'll tell you one more story about that, which was the toughest one, which was when I was a prospect. A bartender at the bar, Susie was her name. Her husband was named P.K. Klein. He was a big, famous Sons of Silence member that had been machine gunned to death in a Colorado Springs bar just a few years before. So I'm sitting there with my sponsor, Bobby Bryant. And so we're drinking some beers at the bar. And Bobby says, "Hey, Bo, I've got it set up where you're going to get to screw Susie tonight." And I'm thinking, "Oh, man, that's great." But deep inside, I'm going, "Oh, crap. I got to get out of this one." And then Susie's walking up, "Hey, Bo, I can't wait." And I'm like, "Oh, me either." I'm like, "Oh, crap." And so this is before we've had the girlfriend thing set up. And I said, I've got to get out of this because that's not going to fly professionally or personally with my wife back home. So I buy Bobby some beers, and I knew him well enough to say, Bobby, PK is such a fixture of this club. And here I am, just a prospect, and I'm going to be screwing his old lady. I said, "Man, I think that just doesn't sound right." And Bobby goes, "You're right. That's not right. You're not screwing Susie." So he stops it. But, but those are the dilemmas that you get put into. Wow. And I mean, they just come at you.
You never know, do you?
No, I had them. I don't know how many dozens of times that I got confronted with problems like that.
So Blake, you mentioned something right there that just startled me, because I didn't realize that when you went deep undercover with the Sons of Silence outlaw motorcycle gang, you had a wife. Did you have? I don't know if you had kids, but you obviously had a wife. How do you deal with it? How does your family deal with the fact that for 2 years you're going undercover and you're becoming an outlaw? How often do you see them? I mean, what are they thinking?
Yeah, no, and it was very difficult. And as I talked about before, when the investigation started, I didn't go into this investigation going, well, I'm going to infiltrate the Sons of Silence and be undercover for 2 years. It was more focused towards learning what criminal activities they were involved in, identifying them, and trying to pick them off from the outside, make arrests and buys and introductions to other people, and slowly just, make a few cases. But one thing led to another, and they wanted me to become a member. And we at ATF thought that would open up doors for other things, which it did. But the journey was a lot more difficult. So as it progressed, it became more and more difficult on my wife and me. A lot of people say when you're undercover, you live 2 lives. But in reality, you live 3. At least I felt I had 3 distinct lives. I had Blake, or Bo, the undercover, Sons of Silence. I had Blake, the special agent with ATF. And then I had Blake, who was a husband and a father to three children.
Wow.
And each one of them needs some of my time and my attention. And there's just hardly not enough time in a day. And as you become a prospect in an outlaw motorcycle gang, you are out there beck and call 24/7.
Wow.
They would hit you on the phone or pager. You had to show up at the clubhouse and be there in 20, 30 minutes. You did. Yeah. It was not even. So I spent one of my 4th of July's in jail as a prospect with the club, so it's not. So it's very tough on the family, and it took years.
Did your family know exactly what you were doing, or could you tell them, or did they just know you were in some type of operation?
Yeah, I mean, I had to, because my family lived up in Woodland Park, which is it's up in the mountains, 15 miles or so from Colorado Springs. That's where our house was.
Right.
I had an undercover house in Colorado Springs, but I didn't have to be there early on all the time. But as it ramped up, pretty soon I had to live in the undercover house because the members would come by my house at any time.
Looking for you. Yeah.
Exactly. And staying with me and doing whatever. So I got to where I wasn't able to get home, but maybe once every couple of weeks.
Wow.
And if I tried to go out with my family to get a pizza or something, I had to tell my wife, okay, here's the story. And we had a story worked up. When I walk away, you understand this. Do not challenge me. So anytime we were out at a grocery store, anytime out, I had to have that story with my wife. So little did she know, she was actually having to work undercover with me.
Right.
But it was difficult. My kids, one story that sticks out in my mind, my kids were playing t-ball because they were only, my daughter, I guess she was 4, and my son was was 3. And so they were really little, playing t-ball in Woodland Park, small town. So up above the little ball field was a parking lot. And I pulled up there thinking I could watch from this truck that I was using. But a police officer came up on me and said, "Hey, we've got calls about this long-haired guy watching these kids down here." Yeah. Well, I couldn't come out of roll. I couldn't tell him that those are my kids. I couldn't. So, you have to walk away from important family things. And
wow.
It's, you just drive back down to the undercover house and, drink a beer and
hang out.
Yeah, reflect, because you just can't. It's hard. So
did you have a story concocted, though? I'm a little confused. You said you and your wife both knew what to say if something happened. Perhaps one of the motorcycle gangs spotted you together. Yes. I mean, is that what you were talking about?
Yes. And the story was, because I had a friend that was a doctor, he was going to be her new old man. That was my old lady from several years ago.
Okay.
And that they lived in Greenwood Village, which is another little town down. So we weren't ever going to mention Woodland Park to him, just Greenwood Village. So my kids and her lived with him, and I just could see him once in a while. But it really never came up much with the Sons of Silence. But if it was enough to where they knew I had an ex-old lady somewhere there in Colorado. So if it popped up, it would. It never did.
Yeah.
But, we didn't go out much either. So.
Right.
Dennis and Bill, I feel like we jumped right into the good stuff. I'm just fascinated by the undercover world of law enforcement.
Indeed.
But I think Blake Boteler's story of how he got into ATF in the first place, let alone the undercover operation, is pretty fascinating. You were a petroleum geologist before you ever became a law enforcement agent at ATF. What's going on there? I mean, a petroleum geologist does not just hop into undercover law enforcement operations normally. What is your story, Blake?
Yeah, I got my Bachelor of Science degree from Texas Tech in petroleum geology, and I had a minor in geophysics. So I was an exploration geologist. That's what I was going to do. So And that's what I was doing for a couple of years. And then one fateful night, I'm going into a bar to shoot some pool there in Oklahoma City, where our offices were. And a guy walks up to me as I get out of my car, and he puts a chrome-plated pistol right between my eyes and says, "Wallet." And I said, "Hey, man, no problem, no problem." So, money's big deal. I only had like $40 in the wallet, So I'm like, "Here you go, man." Well, then I had my class ring on from Texas Tech. And he go, "Rings." And I had that one and another small gold ring that my parents had given me. Well, those kind of pissed me off because, man, those are personal now. You've gone past money. You've gone personal.
Yeah, really?
So he takes it, and then he goes, "Turn around." And I thought, oh, great. I said, "Man, don't shoot me in the back of the head." So I turn around, and I could hear him moving away. And so I immediately turn around. When I say I gave chase, I wasn't trying to close the gap on him, but I had shot enough guns by that time in my life that I knew I had 30 or 40 yards between this guy and this revolver. He's not going to be able to hit me, even if he tried to shoot at me. So I'm just cold trailing him, and he never looks back. But he goes.
You're not carrying a gun at that point, right?
No, I'm not. But I certainly have no desire to catch the guy. I'm just cold trailing to see where he's going. And he never looks back, so he doesn't know I'm behind him. But as he crosses Portland Street, it was a quadplex, 4 buildings with a courtyard in the middle. And I could see he runs into that area. So I have to go kind of real slow. And as I kind of looking around, because I think he's waiting around the corner all the time. But as I get in there, I realize, okay, he's in one of these buildings because there's no place out to get out on the other side. So I call the police. They come, and the officers, he's just honest with me. He goes, "Hey, man, I'm going to be honest. We're probably never going to catch this guy now that he's got away. You need to just go to pawn shops and see if you can find your rings. That's the best you could hope for." And I'm thinking, well, that's bullshit, So
yeah.
So it is getting ready to snow that night. It's February in Oklahoma. It's getting ready to snow that night. And there's a trash dumpster, one of the big square trash dumpsters outside that apartment complex. And I think, you know what? He's going to want to get rid of all that other trash in my wallet. Back in the day, you had credit cards for Texaco. Each one of them had its own individual credit card. I thought he's going to want to dump that stuff. And if he puts it in his trash and throws it in the dumpster, I'll know. But I don't want to dig through everything that's in that dumpster. So I need to go back and see what's in there tonight. So I went back. This time I was armed, and I got in the dumpster, looked around. The next morning, I went back. The new trash that was there, I started going through it. And my dad was with me, and he goes, "Blake, you're never going to find it. It could be anything. It could be this little yellow piece of paper." And back then, you used to write all your phone numbers down on a little stick-up note. Well, that was it. Sure enough, he had put all my credit cards right in the edge of that dumpster. And by chance, about 40 yards away, I see this guy walk by into this little convenience store next door. He's looking at me, and I'm looking at him, and I think, he looks different, but I think that's the guy that stuck me up. And me and my dad go back, and I sit in my company car, which, of course, is a Crown Vic. Looks just like a cop car. But so when the guy comes out of there, he sees that Crown Vic, and he bolts and runs into that quadplex again. I jump out this time, and I get in there quicker, coming through another entrance. Well, he's already gone. So there's only 4 doors he could have made it to. So I go over to that store, and I asked that girl, I said, "That guy that was just in here, what's his story?" She goes, "Oh, he comes in here all the time, spends a lot of money in the payphone. He's got a girlfriend, a black girl with blonde hair and a white dog." I said, "Well, next time he comes in here, you need to call the cops because he's an armed robber." And so I tell the police. Sure enough, we're looking. They give you a photo lineup, and I pick the guy out. So the next day, they're going to go hook him up. But that night, I'm talking to my fiance on the phone, and Oklahoma City breaks in and says, "Hey, we've got a guy in custody up here at this store that the clerk says you say is an armed robber." So sure enough, I drive up there. He won't give consent to search to his apartment, but I point out, I say, "See that girl over there, that black girl with blonde hair holding that little white dog? That's his girlfriend. She lives with him." So they get consent to search the apartment from her And then he comes out and he has my rings and my wallet.
Wow, what a story.
See, you were already a detective then.
Yeah,
Well,
it's in your blood.
well, when you're a geologist, petroleum geologist, you hunt for oil, right? So I guess
Wow.
oil and natural gas. So in law enforcement, you're hunting for bad guys. So, but anyway, the DA.
Is that the incident then that catapulted you into law enforcement?
It was. I got bit by the bug then, and I applied, and ATF was interviewing me, and they go, "Well, you're a geologist. What makes you think you could function if somebody points a gun in your face?" And I said, "Well," and I
Been there.
I pulled out this letter. The DA from Oklahoma City had wrote me this letter. His name was Macy, and I gave it to the special agent in charge. He was a part of the panel, and he read that thing, and literally. That's probably what got me hired or gave me that opportunity to prove myself. So, and here I am now. So,
and what made you apply to ATF though?
I applied to FBI, DEA, and ATF and interviewed with all of them. And I told each one of them, I said, because they said, "Who else have you applied with?" And I told them, and I said, "Who are you going to go with?" I said, "The first one that offers me a position." And so it was, there wasn't any loyalty that I had between any one of those. But interview process, each one of them was different. But ATF, they offered me first and offered me a position in Dallas. And so that's why I came.
So clearly he picked the wrong guy. So what happens? Does he goes to jail? What's the final story there?
Yeah. Well, I didn't know what they were all called at the time, but we go all the way to this probable cause hearing, and I'm sitting in the courtroom, and they're trying to make it sound like I don't know who this guy is. But the judge finally admits all the evidence. And so, yes, he pleads guilty because I'm in there saying, yeah, that's the guy that stuck me up. Yep, that's my wallet. Yeah, that's my rings. So, yeah, that was, I still know the guy's name. I check on him every once in a while. But he's still in trouble.
You check on him, and what's his deal? Still in prison, out on parole, career criminal?
Yeah, he's in and out of prison. Yeah. Now he's older now.
He's just a piece of shit.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. He's
Bill, you and Blake have a lot in common. All right. I don't know how many people in our audience know your story, Bill, but Bill Erfurth was one of the best Miami-Dade cops ever. And the way he started out his career, very early in his career, he went deep undercover with the mafia and became Officer of the Year in Miami-Dade for his good work. Much the same, Blake, as what you did at ATF. And I don't think Bill's lasted quite as long, maybe a year. But Bill, I know you must have loads of questions for Blake. I'm just curious, based on what he's told you so far. I mean, I don't think you were married, and you certainly didn't have kids at the time you went undercover. But what was it like for you? And I'm sure you have plenty of questions for Blake that maybe comparing stories.
Well, the most perplexing thing for me when Blake was talking about this was that he was, in fact, married and had kids. When this happened for me, I was like 25. And it was also something, I was just a general investigations detective at that point. I was working burglaries and, assaults and stuff like that. It was kind of an odd thing. But what's more interesting about Blake made it. Blake made that happen by his abilities and his interaction and being a good actor, right? My situation was I was introduced by informants, and it was a different circumstance. I ended up just stumbling into this very organized burglary ring, and there was a Shylock from New York running this fencing operation out of North Dade off of Ivesbury Road by Aventura. That makes more sense maybe to some people that are listening, but we just set up on that and ended up getting a search warrant. And the next thing you know, we're following these guys that were doing this burglary ring. And they took us to another pawn shop up in Fort Lauderdale area in Dania Beach. And we bust that. go in with a search warrant after doing a buy bust and all that kind of stuff. And the folks that were operating that were former capos of the Bonanno crime family that were on the Federal Witness Protection Program.
Wow.
So then that leads to some other people that lead to the Genovese family, that lead to one thing to the other. And I'm like, holy shit. You know,
that's amazing.
Yeah, it's just kind of wacky.
No,
So the next thing you know, we made some arrests, and they were children. They were children of the bigger mafia people. They were not children. They were in their 20s.
Right.
But they flipped because we had serious charges on these guys, like multiple charges. So they flipped, and it was during the Miami Vice TV show days, and all of a sudden I remember us being in a car together, and they're laughing and like, we are the fucking Miami Vice, and I'm thinking, oh my God, I hope I just lived through all of this nonsense. But they made all these introductions, and
that's awesome.
It was easier for me, but what happened was and then one of their uncles was also on the Federal Witness Protection Program. And all of a sudden the FBI came to our department, and I got called in, and they're like, all right, you got to step away. You got to back off. We're going to take this. You don't know what you're doing here.
Oh,
you're getting involved in things. And the informants told the FBI people to go pound sand because they weren't going to cooperate and do anything unless they did it for me.
That's
and
awesome.
If I was involved. And so ultimately I got detached to the FBI for about a year. And there was plenty of lunacy that went along with that, but it was way different. My circumstance was way different, where, really everything was driven by my informants, and they created the bond and the trust factor with other people, whereas Blake had to earn it.
Yeah. And I think that's the neat thing about these undercover operations. They have their unique twists and turns and challenges all along the way, and so to say that one's more difficult or whatever, you can't do it. You can't compare the apples to oranges. They have challenges, and those challenges that you're throwing out there are amazing to me, because I've never worked within the families like that. So, and I've talked to so many guys, even guys that have done outlaw motorcycle gang infiltrations, and their story's different than mine. I mean, they have different challenges. The Sons of Silence they're an old school type of gang. So when I say that, like, I went to California, or Cave Creek, Arizona, to the Hells Angels clubhouse. We were going to speak with Sonny Barger and stuff. And so we go there, and there's prospects for the Angels walking around in tennis shoes and shorts, and we're looking around going, that would never fly, because you'll never see a Sons of Silence walking around in shorts and tennis shoes. It's boots and jeans all the time. And when you're a prospect with the Sons of Silence, their prospects, the Hells Angels, were drinking beer and talking to girls. You never did that as a prospect with the Sons. I mean, they would kick you. I got punched in the face so many times, slapped. It's so common. They just, I had one situation where a guy said, you see those hummingbirds flying around? We're out at this park. They're camping out for a wedding. And I said, yes, patch holder. He goes, I want one. I don't care if it's dead or alive. And then he pulls out his knife. He goes, and if I don't get it, I'm going to stick you. And he puts his knife away. And that was like Mountain Jerry was the patch holder's name. So here I was as a prospect. I had to now get a hummingbird. And sure enough, that same day, my chapter president got hit by a fire truck and was in the hospital. And I go to the hospital to see him. And what does he say to me? You better get Mountain Jerry that hummingbird. That's all, Go crap.
They're just also freaking nuts, you know.
And the Denver clubhouse was notorious at the time. They'd already put two prospects, their own prospects, in the hospital. Beetlejuice, they busted up his shoulder, put him in the hospital, and then Steve-O, they'd busted his knee and put him in the hospital. So now I'm going to the hospital. I better have me a damn hummingbird. Just a lot of people that helped us make this thing happen. So at this time, Daryl, my partner, was out where his mother lives. And I told him this story that I have to get a hummingbird. He goes, well, my mother had a dead hummingbird in her barn. And I said, man, put that in a FedEx envelope and ship it to me. I got it, put it in my vest, rode to the Denver clubhouse, walked up to Mountain Jerry and said, hey, Mountain Jerry, I got something for you. And I gave him that, and he goes, what the hell's this? I go, it's that hummingbird you wanted. And they were just blown away. You know, my story was I used a box of shotgun shells to get one, but the bottom line was
story too.
it got me out of an ass whooping or actually getting stabbed. Is Mountain Jerry would have stabbed me because they're just that way.
So did you have a name? Like these guys all have names, right? What was your code name in the club? Did you have
my name was Bo.
Bo.
B-O.
Did that have any significance? Was that for some reason that you got Bo?
Well, my undercover name was Daniel Raymond Boyer.
Okay.
Kind of a Cajun play on it. But
okay.
So it went by Bo.
They shortened that to Bo, huh?
Yep. Well, I had shortened it to Bo, and because I would answer to that. You know, one of the things you learn early on in undercover world is don't put out things that are too far out there that you won't be able to live or identify with. So
really?
if I said my name was Jim or whatever, or Snake, and then somebody's yelling Snake, I probably wouldn't. But I've been called Bo since I was a kid in elementary school because people couldn't pronounce my last name, Boteler. Right. They'd leave it at Bo. So that's, and my identity, I developed that early on in my law enforcement career. So it was an identity that ATF and me and everybody else had developed so that if somebody does check me, law enforcement, whoever, it comes back as that's who I am. In fact, I mentioned it briefly as a prospect. My partner Daryl and I were driving through Fort Dodge in Webster County, Iowa. We got pulled over because our tent was too dark. And the officer started searching the vehicle. I said, well, I'm not giving you consent to search. He goes, oh, I don't need it here in Iowa. Well, sure enough, he found our pistols, our ATF pistols. And they threw us down on the side of the road. I had my, prospect vest on and everything. So I'm down on the side of the road, and the Sons of Silence and Hell's Angels, everybody's going by seeing us getting hooked up, getting arrested. So that was July 3rd. And we're sitting in jail. And, we get booked in and everything because we couldn't come out of roll because the Sons of Silence had a chapter there and they were friendly with the police. And now that doesn't mean they're cooperating with the police, but we couldn't take the risk.
All right.
So we just took the ride and got booked in. And that night I saw fireworks out of my jail window because it was 4th of July. And so here it was, Independence Day, and I was sitting in jail.
In part 2, the club bonds him out, and that's when things get truly dangerous. 230 weapons seized, a $50,000 contract on his life, and an arrest plan so unusual it involved a hearse, a fake body, and a funeral plot in Colorado Springs. Part 2 is next.